There are all different kinds of grants that people get to do their work. My personal work and many of our colleagues in this college, much of their work is focused on research grants, which are basically grants in which you propose a specific set of hypotheses or research questions that you're going to test through the activities of this grant. And depending on the funder, those may be things that you as a scientist have completely driven, or that you've developed in consultation with the funding agency in some way, or that it's been driven in some way by the priorities of the funding agency. Obviously, every grant is driven by the priorities of a funding agency, but the extent to which they have a desire to input on what hypotheses or research questions you want to test varies depending on the funder. Those can be distinguished from other kinds of project grants where you're really creating a product or a thing or some kind of deliverable for a funder. And that may be a foundation, it might be a private entity, etc. But you're not asking, in most of those project questions, you're not asking a research question or a hypothesis that you're testing. And so that's the sort of big difference between those two things.
And now the major funders who provide research grants, which is they're highly prized in academic circles, would be NIH, NSF, and any others. Can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on how they differ, what missions they have?
Yep. So our college has largely been funded, and Michigan State is one of the top receivers of funds from the National Science Foundation. So in terms of research grants, there is most of these are funded by public funders that are federal agencies of some kind or state agencies of some kind that have funds to support research specifically. National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, which is a very big, complex organization, USDA, Health and Human Services, and Department of Justice. There's a whole host of federal agencies that have funded research by researchers in our college. National Science Foundation, from a social science standpoint, is probably what I would call our best or our premier funder, because number one, they have a very strong peer review process, which uses actual peers from social science, right? So oftentimes our peers, or many of our colleagues around the college, will serve as reviewers for National Science Foundation, and as will social scientists from around the country. So a lot of our faculty from media and information, faculty from communication, almost all of our colleagues across the departments across the college have some funding from National Science Foundation to do their work. We also receive funding from National Institutes of Health, and within our college, Communicative Sciences and Disorders is probably the group that has received the most National Institutes of Health funding, and that is because there's a specific branch of NIH that focuses directly on communicative disorders. And so that's one part of NIH in which our college has been very successful in getting grants. National Institutes of Health funds a lot of basic health research and a lot of what's called health services research, and is less on the forefront on social science and technology research than National Science Foundation. So that is how I kind of think of the distinction in terms of how, as researchers, we would look at those two organizations. We also have a number of grants from U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is a place where we've had really great luck sort of embedding social questions into bigger projects. And USDA has been very flexible and interested in the social dimensions or the social aspects of various food and ag-related questions. So those are kind of the big funders for our college. We also get money from private institutions like foundations, and some of those at Google and other private corporations. Some are research-related projects and some are more project-based projects.
The challenges with understanding the grant world is to understand the role that Indirect plays. That when it's a public government entity, there is a factor that universities can apply, but the government must fund in order to support their overall activities, sort of the infrastructure costs that it takes to conduct that kind of research. Foundations are increasingly, it seems, they used to give some amounts, it seems less and less do they give any kind of indirect, and it means that universities then have to find ways to support their infrastructure to do this work. Could you give us a sort of an explanation of how Indirect works and what its function is and how those rates are set?
Yeah, so it's not a random process by which they set that percentage, even though people like to believe that sometimes, right? So, every several years, Michigan State participates in a process by which they negotiate their indirect cost return rate. So they have a visit by the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level where they come in, look at our facilities, look at how we're using our space, how we're using our current indirect costs. They look at a whole bunch of factors and renegotiate that facilities and administrative rate, F&A rate, or indirect cost rate. That at Michigan State is 53%, and it's different at every institution across the country. Some places, there are even institutions that have that rate set at 110+%. Okay, so very high prestige institutions get 100. If your project costs $100,000 to do, there's the same amount or maybe even more tapped on as a facility's indirect cost rate that's tapped onto that. I want to say that those funds are used at the central level, at the college level, and at the department level. So there's pieces of that gets distributed across the university. At a very unglamorous level, it's used to keep the lights on and do all sorts of sort of basic infrastructure things, to pay salaries of people to help administer grants, those types of things, because doing grant work takes a lot of administrative time. And so that F&A rate covers that, and that's all very unglamorous, right? But that F&A, that money is also used when it goes back to the departments, particularly to put into a fund to help hire more graduate students in some cases, to hire new faculty, to bring in innovative people to sort of push research agendas within certain units. So units that generate a lot of indirect cost return have more money to do, in my experience, have had more money to do more sort of innovative, cool things with that money to be able to continue to reinvest. The best strategy for that is to reinvest in the research program or the externally, the creative activities program, wherever your unit focus is, and use that money in that way to make an investment back into your unit. And so there are some sort of unglamorous uses of that money, but there's also a real return to units, to departments or schools or whatever, to take that money and build their research and creative activities enterprise within their unit. So that's where it goes.
One of the challenges with the grant I was involved in was 3 agencies, 3 different entities were involved. One was the International City County Management Association, which did have a 110% indirect rate. Another federal group that had 75%, and then ours. And it took 18 months after we received the grant to hammer out the decision as to, they had all decided that we would be getting it on the basis of core amounts plus the indirect. And then we had to negotiate, no, wait a minute, you get a lot more if we do it that way than we do. So that was 18 months of negotiation. You really need to know the indirect rates of other groups you may be collaborating with and settle those things before you get to the part where you're trying to spend the funding.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than negotiating how to spend money once it's come in, right? So the time to negotiate all that stuff and to understand all that stuff is when you're putting together the project. And one thing we see regularly is our staff try and help with that conversation, but ultimately it's an investigator who has a relationship with the unit with whom they're working. And so it's important for the investigator to have honest conversations, learn about what the ins and outs are of some of this budgeting stuff that's going to be controversial, and try and head off some of those conversations early so that ultimately what most researchers or folks who are doing projects or whatever, what they care about is having the money to do the project. And in in many ways, that's all anybody really wants, is for us to bring in money to be able to do the research that people want to do, or do the creative activities that people want to do in the college. But that requires to be thoughtful about, how do we manage the facilities questions and all the other questions that go along with that. One thing that I would just say is the indirect cost rate is dependent on the organization with whom the funder, and then also the organizations with whom you're working on the project. So can be very complex. And it would be unfair for me to not admit that grants that have a higher indirect cost return rate they're often more valued by central administration because they bring in more money. But it also coincides with the fact that those agencies that pay the highest IDC rate are also some of the highest prestige agencies in our various fields. So National Science Foundation and NIH, who are the two sort of premier funders, they pay full IDC rate. And so there's that combination of both. Yes, they pay that money, but also they're a place, particularly NSF, where we see that as part of a peer review process where it really validates or helps to validate a researcher's research portfolio.
One of the other elements of cost that outsiders sometimes don't understand is that when you do a rough calculation of how much somebody's time is going to take, you need to also calculate in the fringe on top of that.
Yes.
And so then in addition to the indirect, so there are some of these additional costs where it may sound like an entity is receiving a huge budget to do something, but when you actually see the dollars available to do all the work you want to do, you need to be careful in putting together budgets.
Yeah, and so the biggest expense in almost every budget I see go by my desk is personnel costs. And that's because it's not just somebody's salary, but if you're a grad student, it's paying your tuition, if it's paying the fringe, your health care, it's everything. So it's not just salary, and grad students might say, well, I don't make that much money, but it's not just the salary or the stipend that you're getting paid. It's to cover your healthcare costs, to cover your tuition costs, to cover all these other costs. And for a faculty member, it's the same thing. And so one thing that investigators always have to be thoughtful about is, how much time reasonably can I expect the various people on my grant to be able to contribute to my grant, and how much can I really afford? I might, in a dream world, want 20% of Professor X's time, but that 20% is not only, if they're a very senior person, it may be a high salary, but then it's also the fringe and all the other incidental costs on top of that.
Explain a little bit about the role of the principal investigator, how you decide who becomes the principal investigator, how that process normally takes place, and whether those people over time have the opportunity to build relationships with certain program officers at these various agencies.
So making a decision about who's a PI on a project is something that sometimes it's very obvious who the PI should be on a project, and sometimes it's not. Right? So sometimes it's very clear that if you're doing something that's directly in somebody's substantive area of research and other people are sort of tangential to the project, then it's obvious that they should be the PI. In many other cases, though, there are qualifications of team members that makes that decision more complicated. There's also questions about time and who actually has the time to be able to devote to both writing the proposal, but then ultimately doing the project if it's funded. And so all these things factor into the decision-making process. And ultimately, it should be a collaborative decision that's made by the people who are working on the project proposal, right? So it should be a discussion. Like, I'll take my own last project proposal that I did. It was requested, or my participation was requested from a researcher in large animal sciences on a project on antibiotic resistance. And there's a communication side. Without going into all the details of this, I recognize that I have some expertise that they need, but there's another person on campus who I've worked with before who's actually better positioned to lead some of these efforts than I would be. I also recognize that I didn't have very much time. So I said, listen, I not only do I know somebody who's better, but I'm also just maxed out right now, right? And so, so then we have this big conversation among all of us, and sometimes this is a very easy conversation if these are people you know and that you've worked with before. In other cases, it's not an easy conversation, and there's this sort of well, I need this or I need this, and there can be some awkward conversations about who becomes the PI in a project if it's not an obvious case. So I guess the long story short of that is it should be a negotiated decision by members of the research team that factors in both expertise and time commitment on the part of the investigator. And then the part that I haven't touched is you're ultimately trying to get this project funded by somebody. And so in some cases, the sort of second part of your question, in some cases, some investigators have connections with the funding agency, have worked with particular program officers in the past, are familiar or have served on review panels for a particular part of an agency. And so they might be brought in. They might be the best person to lead it, or they might be great secondary person or a great advisory committee to be brought in as part of a project. So one key, I think, to the grant getting process that's very important is connecting with funding agencies, connecting with program officers, and talking about projects, which I might return to that in a few minutes.
In the application process, that part, there's sort of I have a great idea and now I will look for somebody and shop for someplace that might fund it. And then there's the other sort of opportunity that sometimes arises where you're reading an RFP that someone has sent you and you say, boy, that's close. It may not be precisely what I'm doing right now, but I could see how that might be something I could tailor to meet their goals. And it seems that part of the challenge is you can't go too far afield and try to pretzel your project into an RFP that it doesn't fit. I've seen a lot of wasted time take place on those kinds of proposals.
Yes.
So what is the better strategy in terms of overall success rate? Because the success rate in grants is quite honestly not that high.
No, it's not. I think that what I tell our junior faculty in the college is do what you love. The reason you're going after grants is to fund the work that you love and that you're passionate about and where you know the really good ideas are in your area. And however, as you seek funding for that work, it is your job to really do your homework and learn about where the opportunities are for doing the kinds of things you love, and then to really investigate and research those opportunities in a significant way to figure out if the kinds of things you're doing can really fit with a particular set of funding priorities. And I'll give you an example of how I would suggest doing this, or how I've told investigators to do this. Basically, people will come to me all the time and say, I've got this idea, but I just don't know who would fund it. Maybe NSF's interdisciplinary behavioral social sciences group. Do you think they'd fund something like this? And I say, well, I don't know, but here's what you should do to find that out. And so with every RFP and with every area of a funder that's devoted to a particular kind of funding, there's a backstory to that, right? So they didn't just say, today I think we'll fund this, right? There's years of strategic planning or priority setting and research that went into making decisions about where a funding agency is funding things for many funders. Now, that's not always true for foundations, where they can be more haphazard in their approach to, or seemingly haphazard in their approach to how they fund things. So your job as a researcher is to figure out that backstory, right? How did they get to this place with their funding priorities? What's the basis of this? And I have an example of a project that I worked on where we had what we thought was kind of a good idea. And so we saw a particular part of NIH that we thought might be a good funder for this. We started digging into the place you always start is, what else have they funded? What else has this funder funded in this space? And that should be your number one thing you do if you think, okay, this might be the place, is to start digging into their funding portfolio. And many of the funding agencies have great websites that you can just search. You can, like the last project I got, we searched every word that had anything to do with our project to see what are they doing in this space? What else are they funding in this space? How are we like this? Do we fit with it? Are we different? How are we different, right? And then the next thing, so once you've done all that homework, you can create a one-pager of your idea and put the bio sketches together of your project team and reach out directly to the program officer or the program person at that funder and say, here, I am this person. I'm Maria Lapinski. I have an idea. I think it fits with the kind of thing you do, but I'm not sure. Would you be willing to talk to me about it? And then you think about some questions you have, some informed question based on the research that you've done. And what you'll learn from that is some things sometimes that aren't obvious. Oh, wait, and I forgot one thing that you would do. You would always read the request for proposals and read all the project materials for the funder. Sometimes in those requests for proposals, they'll say the basis of this RFP is this document. And it'll take you to the background document, which is where they set the priorities. Sometimes it'll be an article that one of the program officers wrote about this issue that's published in a scientific journal. Sometimes that's not there. And so when you call the program officer or you talk to the program officer or meet with them, you'll see they'll say, this is the article that drove these funding priorities for this agency. And you'll go read that and say, wow, this what we want to do really fits with this, or no, it doesn't. And both of those are good outcomes because if you find that out early, it saves you from putting a proposal into somebody who would never have funded that anyway, right? So, and if it does fit with what they want, then that opens the door for a bigger conversation with the program officer.